He lived alone in a snowbound cabin until a pregnant exile collapsed at his door and revealed her heir. The trees stood gaunt and wind blasted, their branches etched against a steely sky, an isolated cabin at the edge of nowhere, heavy with loneliness, simmering with unease, and pulsing with faint hope. Graham Walker swung his axe with deliberate force, each strike echoing through the frozen stillness. He stacked logs by the hearth, fingers numb, but steady, stoic, self-reliant, never one for idle chatter. The snow lay deep outside, but inside the fire's orange glow fought back the chill. A soft knock shattered the rhythm. Graham wiped sweat from his brow and crept to the door. Beyond the threshold stood a stranger, a heavily pregnant woman, cloak, torn eyes shadowed by exhaustion. She clutched a broken crest and a locket that gleamed like a promise or a warning. Graham's jaw went taut. He reached for the locket. Inside, a faded portrait of a gilded crown and a name he couldn't place. A secret buried too deep. He stepped back. "Reckon you've got a story," he said, voice low. She offered no answer, only a fleeting smile and the distant echo of hoofbeats. Who is she, and what price must they pay? A lone lantern swayed in the doorframe of the weather-worn cabin, cutting through the swirling snow like a promise of refuge. Graham Walker knelt beside his stove, pressing a fresh bandage against his wife's old journal, now stained by his own grief. He paused, haunted by the memory of her laughter, echoing here long ago, before fever claimed both his wife and child. He brushed a calloused hand across the wood, vowing silently he'd never fail another soul seeking shelter. A soft scrape on the frosted threshold snapped him to attention. He rose, shouldered his rifle, and peered out. Snowflakes danced in the lantern's glow. A figure stumbled toward him through the drifts. She wore a cloak fastened with a bent brooch, once ornate, now scarred, and clutched a small silver locket etched with a crowned lion. The metal gleamed dully, as if weighted by her secret. Graham stepped aside wordlessly, motioning her in. She obeyed, breath, ragged eyes wide with desperation. He closed the door against the storm, bolting it twice. She sank onto a stool by the fire, one hand pressed against her side. Blood darkened the hem of her gown. Graham knelt and carefully peeled back the torn cloth. A shallow slash, raw and weeping, ran across her ribs. His heart clenched as he recognized the telltale signs of a close blade too neat for an accident. He tore a strip from his flannel shirt and wrapped her wound with steady fingers. She hissed pain, sharpening her pale features. In the lantern light, he made out tears sliding down her cheeks. "You'll live," he whispered, though neither believed it. She closed her eyes, leaning into his warmth. He fetched water from the kettle and fed it to her in slow sips. Her lips trembled around the rim. As she drank, she traced the locket's crown with trembling fingers, lifting it for him to see. He caught a glimpse of faded initials beneath the lion's mane, ER. No other mark. He tucked the locket inside his coat pocket to keep it safe proof of her past and a beacon for her pursuers. "How'd you find me?" he asked softly. She opened her eyes, voice hushed as wind through pines. "They said you were a hermit, no questions asked." I had no other choice. A pulse of guilt hit Graham. He remembered the frontier rumors that drew men to his cabin, talk of a woodsman who spared strangers. He'd carved that reputation from solitude and sorrow. Now it drew a hunted woman in peril. She pressed a hand to her belly, eyes flicking to the wooden floor. "I'm with child," she murmured. "They want him alive." Graham's jaw clenched. In his mind he saw his own child's cradle empty forever. He swallowed. "Then I'll keep you both breathing." Outside, distant hoofbeats rolled like thunder. He stiffened. "They're close." She closed her eyes. "They fear I have allies here." Her tone held no shame, only hard-won resolve. She had traveled far, steering clear of roads, following rumors to this cabin at the forest's edge. Graham moved to the window, peering through the frost. He spied dark shapes between trunks, men on horseback rifles slung scanning for her. He returned gathering blankets and a tin of whiskey. He sat beside her, pressed the flask to her lips. The burn soothed her throat. Color returned to her cheeks. He placed a hand on her shoulder, meeting her gaze. Deep in his chest, a spark kindled, protect, redeem, avenge. The memory of his wife's fevered final days flickered. He would not watch another life fade. Behind them, the cabin walls groaned under the storm's weight. Ahead lay a gauntlet of wood and snow. Together they would face it, he with his rifle and traps, she with her hidden past and unborn legacy. Graham rose, checking his rifle's lock. She lay back, clutching the locket. Outside, hoofbeats paused as if waiting. He pulled her close. "Rest," he whispered. "I'll see them off." She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. He placed the bent brooch on the mantel where firelight could never fully burn it. And as the wind screamed around the cabin, Graham Walker felt a purpose reborn to guard this stranger, her child, and the secret they carried into the heart of the storm. Graham's first light was met by silence thicker than the storm had left. Eliza remained nestled in furs, rising only when he poured strong coffee into a tin cup. He handed it to her without a word. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his in thanks before her hand recoiled at the ache in her ribs. He watched her drink, noting how every swallow tightened her brow. Not this time, he reminded himself, recalling his wife's last fevered groans. Never again. By mid-morning, he had refreshed her dressing warm herbal compress from pine resin and willow bark to dull the pain-fresh bandage wound tight. She lay back, eyes fluttering closed as relief and exhaustion mingled. Graham knelt by the hearth, staring into the embers as memories flickered her laughter in summer light, a child's cry in a cradle now empty. His chest ached. Eliza stirred and offered to help. Graham hesitated, but then handed her a worn broom. She swept the floor in long, measured strokes, the bristles whispering secrets of steadiness and purpose. He paused, leaning on his axe. "You don't have to," he began, but she shook her head. "I need to," she said, voice hoarse. "This is my debt to you." Her words carried more than gratitude, an unspoken recognition that he'd saved her life. She moved with deliberate care, stacking logs for the stove and folding fresh linens on the makeshift bed. For a moment they worked side by side, and he noticed the way her hands flexed, sure of themselves despite pain. They paused as the wind rattled the cabin. Horses' hoofbeats ground against drifting snow. Graham peered through the frost-laced window. Two riders crested the rise rifles shouldered. He turned from the sight jaw set. Over a late breakfast of salted pork and hardtack, softened in broth, Eliza offered what she knew. They expected Kiowa allies, she explained, eyes fixed on her spoon. When none came, they hired trackers, professionals who know these woods. Her lips pressed tight. They'll learn each trap, adapt. Graham tapped his knife on the table, sparks dancing in her gaze. "Then we change ours." He stood and went outside. Eliza followed to the supply shed. Together they improved his work. Graham placed sharpened stakes at new angles. Eliza wove cord from spare rope to create tripping snares along the cabin flank. She pointed out a narrow gully where a hidden ledge could double as a firing perch. He marked it on the snow, nodding approval. At the ridge's lip, he demonstrated a misdirection, hollow logs set to magnify noise, baited with fresh deer meat to draw predators, human or beast, away from the cabin. Eliza watched the wild strategist in her emerging as she suggested camouflaging the snares with pine needles. He caught her glance, admiration tempered by pragmatism. That night after the workshop, they sat by the dying fire bodies, leaning toward warmth. He offered her a flask of whiskey. She drank appreciative, then turned the question on him. "Why help me?" He stared into the glow. "Lost more than I deserved," he confessed. "My family? I failed them." He closed his eyes. "You came here because you heard a hermit's name. I need to believe that man still does right." Eliza reached for his hand. "I've known betrayal," she said softly, "and naked fear. You chose to save me anyway." His jaw flexed her words, an unexpected balm. "Then I owe you," he said. "And your son." Her fingers brushed the pouch where the locket rested. "He's worth any debt." They fell silent, listening to the forest's breathing. Outside, the hoofbeats had hushed, but their echo lingered in the cabin's walls. Pre-dawn brought the real test. Graham positioned Eliza behind the tripwire-laden doorway while he took the perch in the gully above. He sighted his rifle heart, thudding with anticipation. Eliza clutched her brooch knuckles white. Neither spoke. A lone rider materialized at the threshold, pausing as the wire snapped. He glanced up, saw silhouettes, and fired. The bullet cracked through logs above Graham's position. He returned fire, the recoil jolting his shoulder but not his aim. A cry, a fall. The rider tumbled back. Graham fired twice more, each shot a punctuation of warning. Below, Eliza heard the collapse, exhaled a breath she didn't know she held. He descended to join her. He extinguished her fear with a rough grin. "One down," he said. She nodded. "And how many left?" His gaze slid to darker shapes among the pines. "Enough," he answered. They retreated inside, sealing the door with a bar. Graham stripped off his coat, and Eliza pressed fresh cloth to his welted shoulder, his wound from the first skirmish. Her touch was gentle, her eyes steady. He hissed at the sting, but closed his eyes, accepting her care. In the firelight, they shared fragments of themselves. He spoke of building the cradle of his wife's lullabies. She described gilded halls and forbidden letters, her voice rich with longing and remorse. Each confession wove them tighter, two souls clutched by loss, now tethered by necessity. As darkness fell fully, they checked each trap one last time. Eliza strapped the locket and brooch inside her gown close to her heart. Graham loaded his weapons round by round, each click a note in their joint symphony of survival. He watched her pale profile in the lantern's glow. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we hold this cabin, no matter what comes." Her hand found his. Together. They settled in for an uneasy sleep, Eliza on the cot, Graham by the door. The cabin stood between two worlds, inside hope, born of shared purpose, outside the gathering night and the promise of steel and snow. And in that fragile quiet they prepared to face the next dawn. A low crack echoed through the cellar as the first trap snapped into action. Graham, perched on the gully's ledge, watched two riders cautiously test the ground beneath his angled tripwire, a design Eliza had described from lessons in royal war chambers. The first man stumbled, his boots skidding on snow before he plunged face first. Graham's finger found the trigger and a single shot rang out, splintering the cabin's outer wall. Silence swallowed the gully. Below in the cramped cellar, Eliza hunched behind stacked crates, clutching the silver locket and brooch. Moonlight seeped through the vent, illuminating her tense profile. Graham descended the ladder, sweat trickling down his temple despite the cold. He knelt beside her gently, sliding a fresh bandage over her side where the blade had cut deep. Her breath hitched with each deft motion of his hands. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you sooner," she whispered. "Your help." He placed a finger to her lips. "Not now." His gaze hardened as splintered wood groaned above. "Eliza," he urged softly. She closed her eyes and drew a shuddering breath. "I'm Lady Eliza Ravenscroft," she declared. Blood glinted on her lips. "My father's line is exiled." "My son," she pressed a hand to her belly. "He is the last heir." A distant shout rattled the joists. "They want him alive." Graham's heart clenched with an emotion more potent than duty tenderness for this woman who'd risked everything, a longing to protect her beyond crowns or politics. He thought of the empty cradle he'd built for his lost child and made a silent vow this child would live. Above, booth heels tapped. Eliza's fingers closed around the bent brooch, a silver lion twisted by conflict. Graham nodded. She rose, bracing herself against the stone wall, and unscrewed the locket. With steady aim, she lofted it through the vent. It caught moonlight arcing toward the cabin floor. A tracker's voice hissed. The crest footsteps thundered. Graham seized the moment. He grabbed Eliza's arm and swept her into a dark corner. Now he growled. He cocked dual pistols, each click a hammering heartbeat. A masked man reached for the locket. Graham fired through the vent. The first shot shattered the horse's bridle. The second ripped into the man's shoulder. He howled, dropping to one knee. Splinters rained as the cabin door crashed open. Graham pivoted, firing into the gloom. One attacker pitched forward. Another lunged down the ladder. Graham met him mid-step, pistol butt striking ribs, pressing him back against the cellar's threshold. The man tumbled, a spray of snow and broken wood. The final intruder smashed against the barricade. Graham leveled his last shot at the rifle barrel, splintering metal in a sharp cry. The attacker recoiled, plunging back into the gully. Eliza sank to her knees, chest heaving as Graham collapsed the ladder. The cellar sealed them away, walls humming with the echo of recent violence. Moments passed. Eliza pressed trembling fingers to her abdomen where their child kicked in reassurance. Graham knelt and wrapped her in his coat, pulling her close. Her cheek pressed against his chest, she whispered, "They'll come back more prepared." He brushed hair from her forehead. "Then we'll be even more ready." A distant ridge shout confirmed their foes regrouped. Eliza's gaze drifted to the broken brooch at Graham's feet, a symbol of her past, now fractured. She placed it in his palm. "You've saved more than a crown," she said, voice raw. "You've saved me." Graham closed his fist around the brooch, resolve forging like steel. He pressed a hand to her belly. And this little one. Above, hoofbeats faded as the trackers withdrew. In the dim hush, two wounded souls, one a fallen noblewoman, one a grieving woodsman, found new purpose to face whatever dawn would bring together. The first pink gleam of sunrise barely touched the horizon when Graham led Eliza from the cabin's ashes. He slid the bent brooch into her palm and secured the silver locket beneath her gown, its weight a reminder of the legacy she carried. The mare stamped and snorted, condensing their breath into clouds of steam. Together they mounted Graham, settling behind her, one arm wrapped around her waist to ease each sharp step. They rode the narrow path that wound down toward Bone Picker's Creek. Pines bowed under frost, and the world felt suspended between night's cold grip and dawn's reluctant warmth. Every hoofbeat echoed in Graham's chest, a prayer to outrun their pursuers. "Eliza, lean in," he murmured the words nearly lost in the wind. She complied, her arm across his shoulder, her head against the back of his coat. The bond between them was palpable, a tether stronger than any chain of command. He guided the mare into a drifted gully where he had hidden sharpened stakes beneath shallow snow. At Eliza's subtle shift, the hoof scraped one stake and it snapped upright, a silent alarm. The mare jumped, but did not panic. Eliza's signal and angle of her chin warned Graham the first trap worked. He gritted his teeth, listening for curses from behind. From the ridge, hoofbeats roared 5 riders in close formation. Their leader, distinguished by a carved ebony staff, seemed impatient. Graham urged the mare over a fallen log, satisfying a second trap of coiled wire that yanked a man from his saddle with a yelp. Snow erupted as he tumbled, blanketing him in white. Eliza swallowed against the chill. "I've seen these tactics in royal campaigns," she said quietly. "Divide and encircle, they'll try to box us in." Her voice carried the steel of command taught in war rooms far from any forest. Graham nodded, guiding the mare off the track and into a hidden hollow beneath a spruce. He eased Eliza down, catching her before she could stumble. Her ribs flinched. She grimaced. "I learned to mend warhawks," she said, pressing a cloth to his shoulder where an earlier splinter had gashed him. Delicate work, but precise. Her fingers bled into the cloth, staining it crimson. He leaned into her touch. "I'll never let you fall," he vowed, voice raw with emotion. The trackers paused at the creek's edge, scanning the snowy bank. Graham sighted his rifle, cocking it with deliberate calm. Eliza stood at his side, brooch and locket gleaming under her breast. Suddenly the leader raised his staff. "This ends now, woodsman," he called, voice echoing off stone. "Surrender the heir." Eliza stepped forward, ribs protesting. "He's not a bargaining chip," she declared, voice clear as cold water. "He's my son." Tension rippled through the riders. Graham's finger trembled on the trigger. He fired his rifle at the nearest horse, not to kill, but to unseat its rider. The mount reared its rider, thrown into a drift with a cry. Another shot from Eliza's pistol clipped a rider's cloak. Chaos rippled through the enemy lines. "Back off," Graham barked, raising both pistols in a challenge. The trackers exchanged uncertain glances. Their leader's face, pale under his hood, betrayed doubt. He lowered his staff. One by one, hooves turned away. The retreating group melted into white. The ridge exhaled silence. Eliza exhaled, hand trembling as she gripped his coat. "They think us cornered," she murmured. "But we know these woods." Graham offered a small smile and helped her remount. The mare moved with confidence, now guided by two riders determined to survive. They followed the creek's icy curves, snow crunching beneath hoof and boot. Graham pointed to a narrow ledge half hidden beneath overhanging firs. "This way," he said. The path was treacherous, slippery rock and hidden pools of water. Eliza's face paled as she navigated. Graham dismounted and led the mare, half carrying Eliza across the slick surface. Each step was a victory over frost and fear. At the ledge's end, they paused. Below, the canyon floor stretched, lit now by spreading daylight. The trackers had lost their trail. Graham crouched before Eliza, eyes earnest. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "I can see the cost of your truth." She placed a hand on the locket against her heart. "Because you showed me trust," she replied. "And because I learned that a crown means nothing without the life it must protect." He nodded. Memories of his wife's final gasp came unbidden, the helplessness, the vow he had failed to keep. He drew her into an embrace, careful of her wound. The thrum of her heartbeat pressed into his palm, a rhythm that promised redemption. They pressed onward along a hidden game trail, following the creek's distant murmur. Graham pointed out small caves and hollows, natural shelters he had marked weeks before, anticipating winter's worst. Eliza marveled at his foresight. Mid-morning sunlight filtered through jagged branches, warming their backs. Yet danger lurked, a sudden crack above warned of falling ice. Graham pulled Eliza aside, shouting a warning. A shard plummeted splintering snow beside them. She closed her eyes, pressing against him. He swept her hair back, stern and gentle. "Two survivors," he muttered, voice thick. "Not just a woodsman and a noble exiled, but two souls forged into one." Eliza opened her eyes. Together, she affirmed, "No matter what comes." Below, the creek widened into a frothing pool. Graham dismounted and led the mare through the shallow's water, cold enough to sting. He cradled Eliza's wounded side as she crossed, each step a testament to her endurance. On the far bank, he tied the mare to a sturdy fir. He produced the brooch and locket, placing them atop a smooth boulder as markers of their passage. He'd forgotten to eat. She pressed a sausage to his lips. He bit, reflecting on how sustenance had once belonged only to survival. Now it fueled hope. Their sanctuary lay ahead, a hidden inlet where the creek fed a spring warmed by underground vents, a place he had discovered in spring. Warm water gurgled beneath frost, beckoning weary feet. Eliza sank into the near-tepid water, wincing at the cold skin that greeted her wound. Graham knelt beside her, pouring more hot water from his kettle. He cleaned the old dressing and rewrapped it, each motion deliberate, reverent. "You're healing," he observed. She smiled, pale but genuine. "Better with care." He held her gaze. "I'll keep you safe," he promised. "Not for a crown, but for you." She placed her hand over his. "That's all I ever wanted." Above them, ravens wheeled against the pale sky. Their cries heralded a new chapter, battered but unbroken. Graham and Eliza pressed into the wilderness. Two hearts bound by shared shadows, forging a path of their own making. They rode down the final slope as the sun dipped behind distant ridges, casting the valley in molten gold and shadow. Graham guided his mare through a thicket of alder and ash, the air growing warmer with the promise of underground springs. At last they reached a clearing where steam rose in lazy spirals from fissures in the rock. The world beyond cold, unforgiving, felt miles away. Graham dismounted and wrapped his arm around Eliza's waist as she slipped from the saddle. Each step pained her side, but her gaze was steady. This patch of earth would be their refuge. He led her to a ruined log cabin half swallowed by moss and vine. He swept away vines to reveal a broken door frame, then set to work clearing snow and debris. Eliza watched from a bench of moss-covered stone wind tugging at her hair. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the soft kick of movement. A mixture of nerves and relief washed over her. The child she carried would know cradle and fire, not war chambers and exile. Graham gathered fallen logs and stones, rebuilding walls with careful precision. Eliza fetched strips of canvas from her satchel and helped patch a gaping hole. They muffled the floor with firs and pine boughs, creating a makeshift birthing space. Graham's hands were sure, chopping, fitting, stacking, each action a testament to his determination. As the cabin took shape, Eliza set up a small hearth outside, arranging stones in a circle. She dropped kindling into the fire pit, coaxing sparks to life. Flames flickered against her pale face, revealing determination born of necessity. She wrapped wool blankets around her shoulders and pressed a bowl of hot soup into Graham's hands. "I've not eaten all day," she admitted, voice soft as the wind in the pines. He offered a thin smile. "You'll need strength." He sipped the broth, feeling warmth seep into his bones. The child stirring within Eliza seemed to echo his own heartbeat. Night fell quickly, and they carried lanterns into the cabin. Shadows danced across half-built walls. Graham fetched clean water from the spring and laid fresh bandages on a wooden table. Eliza's breaths were shallow as she settled onto a bed of furs. He knelt at her side, unbuttoning her coat to reveal the healing gash on her ribs. The old bandage had held. The wound was closing. He rinsed a cloth in warm water, then dabbed gently at her side. Eliza winced, but no tears came this time, only fierce acceptance. "Thank you," she whispered, voice hoarse, "for everything." He pressed her hand to his cheek. "For being here." They listened to the stream's hush outside the cabin walls. The only other sound was the soft nip of cold air escaping through cracks. Graham checked his weapons one last time, revolver, pistol, and a hunting knife strapped to his belt. Eliza traced the outline of the brooch beneath her collar. "We buried it back there," she said, "but it's in my mind more than the ground." He nodded, understanding that some burdens never rest with the earth. They lay together on the bearskin bed, bodies close enough to share warmth. Eliza's breathing deepened. Her eyes drifted closed as exhaustion took hold. Graham kept watch by the door. Lantern light flickered across his stubble and creased brow. Memories of his wife's final night swirled like ghosts, but this time he would not fail. He whispered a promise into the stillness: "You will not suffer alone." Eliza stirred and her voice cracked the quiet. "It's coming," she breathed. "Now!" He sprang to his feet, heart pounding. He lifted her gently, guiding her toward a stack of furs. She settled among them, hand pressed to her side. Graham moved quickly. He lit extra lanterns, set a pot of steaming broth on a nearby stone, and wrapped warm cloths around his arms. Her first contraction rippled through the cabin. She gasped, clutching the brooch. Graham knelt, sliding his hand under her elbow. "Breathe," he said, voice both firm and gentle. She exhaled like wind through canyon walls, slow, steady. The next wave came sharper. He pressed a locket to her lips, its cool metal a steady anchor. Eliza bit down on quiet grit, pressing his hand to her heart. With each contraction, they moved as one breath beat breath. Time warped. The world beyond the cabin ceased. His memories of loss were eclipsed by this moment of creation. At last, a cry shattered the hush, a tiny keening ring that filled the cabin like dawn itself. Eliza's shoulders slumped as sweat and tears mingled. Graham scooped the child into his arms, a fragile bundle wrapped in blankets, wailing the promise of life. Eliza touched her son's head, a tremulous smile crossing her bloodless lips. "He's perfect," she whispered. Graham rested the newborn against her chest. "Welcome to the world," he murmured. Outside, ravens cawed across the dark valley, a chorus of witness. Within the cabin, a family was born, a woodsman, a noble exile, and an heir whose future would be written not by crown nor command, but by the quiet forging of love and blood. As Eliza closed her eyes against exhaustion, Graham kept vigil. The baby slept, warming against his coat. Shadows danced on the log walls, silhouettes of two protectors bound by fate. They had survived the claws of politics and the bite of steel. Now, in a cabin pieced together from ruin, they faced the new dawn, a life unclaimed, a legacy uncharted, and a sanctuary they had earned with every shared breath. Dawn's pale light filtered through frosted pines, painting the valley in hues of silver and blue. Eliza lay propped against the log wall, the newborn cradled at her breast, his breath steady in the quiet cabin. Outside, steam curled languidly from the spring's fissures, an eternal songbird calling them back to a world beyond refuge. Graham stirred, shaking off the thin film of sleep that clung to his shoulders. He eased himself to his feet, careful not to disturb Eliza's rest. He knelt beside her and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, soft porcelain, tinged with exhaustion and wonder. "How are you feeling?" he asked, voice low. Eliza blinked twice, adjusting the infant so he latched properly. "Better," she whispered. "He's perfect." Graham smiled, his heart lightening. He rose and stepped outside, inhaling cool mineral-tinged air. The valley yawned before him, mossy ruins overgrown with ferns, the creek gurgling past smooth stones, and the distant ridges crowned with frost.